Thank you very much, and good afternoon to the panel and OPG, CNSC, and the public that are here. My name is Anna Tilman, and I'm presenting on behalf of the International Institute of Concern for Public Health. The presentation that we're delivering is stressing a few factors. One is the inventory, which I believe is one of the most critical parts of this whole project, because that determines what is being proposed to be buried. It is critical. The expansion plans are for including decommissioning waste, which also affects the inventory, and WIP, which is also a matter of an inventory situation, what was in the container to which there purportedly was an accident. In terms of the inventory itself, in our 2013 submission last year to the JRP, one of the points that was stressed was the lack of completeness of the inventory that I could determine on the basis of even what was stated in the documents. Key radionuclides were absent, or somewhere, I don't know which ones. I'm part of the public, so I'm not sure what was missing or not. So it was a letter from Dr. Greening on January 6, 2014 that revealed serious issues, underestimations, and errors in the inventory related to pressure tube wastes and garter, whatever they're called now, I forget the name, but I'll come to it in a minute. And subsequently to this, as a result of the statements by Dr. Greening, OPG did a revised interim inventory in response to the information requests. Now, in this revision, some startling errors were found. Here's a highlight on this slide referring to tritium's content, cesium, curium, which was completely missing, most active transuranic in the waste. Now I got it. And the garter springs, which were omitted and resulted in increased concentrations of nickel isotopes. Other nuclides were also increased. Now, here's a reference table I've put together based on the Appendix A in OPG's consolidated response, indicating what the difference was for some of the isotopes in the waste compared to what their original inventory was and the ratio of this waste. Now, I want to make a point here that's very critical from a public perspective. Dr. Greening is an expert in this field. He was able to detect these errors. If, in my own field, if such errors were made by my engineering students in an exam that I set, I would know the answers, and if they made these kind of responses, they would get a grade of F. But how do we, the public, who are not experts, know that errors were made? We don't know. And we need to trust OPG to get this information correct. But we need to trust them, but I'm afraid that trust is not there. And if OPG can't get this present inventory correctly and as complete as possible, how can they get their projections correct for the future? So that is a huge concern. Also, these are errors we're not sure if they're I'm not sure if the other elements of the radioactive inventory were also checked. What other errors have been made in the inventory that have not been detected? Because nobody has had that expertise from outside to go and check this. So these are some of the issues. And we wonder how this transfers to other errors made in reports. Now, specifically, OPG has said the DGR was developed, case was developed, knowing the inventory was uncertain. In a newsletter, a community newsletter from the Western Waste Management Facility, it stated OPG was aware that the waste inventory was an estimate, and the DGR case was developed knowing the inventory was uncertain. These statements are not reassuring to the public. In OPG's response, they also minimize the impact of the underestimations by saying, well, it doesn't reflect, if you look at the total inventory, these were particularly relatively small changes. But we, again, cannot trust that because we don't know what other errors are made. They're large enough to disturb any confidence that we may have had in these. Now, specific issues in the inventory beyond the numbers themselves. Pressure tubes. The nuclear facilities at Pickering, Bruce, and Darlington may be operating well beyond the end of life of the pressure tubes. Has OPG considered what the impact would be on the inventory? What the concentration of radionuclides might be? Would it be increased? Neutron activation. I'm not sure how well or what models are used and how appropriate they are to result in the concentration of activation products. Then there's the matter of non-radioactive components in the waste streams. The list of these components is incomplete. And OPG noted that their list was not intended to include all stable end products of all radionuclides, only elements that are important for overall chemical composition. I question how OPG judges what chemicals are important, especially in the case of a DGR over a very long term. Another issue that's come up is, besides the list being incomplete, is metals in the waste. And that has been mentioned. Some of these metals are pyrophoric. It could lead to fires, and there have been zirconium fires in industrial settings. But there's no discussion as to concerns of the containment of these wastes. Nitrite salts has come up for discussion, but there's no mention of that in their reports as to any concerns that this might have. We'd only hear it now at the hearing. Now, has OPG reviewed this component of the inventory, especially organic waste, especially after the WIP radiation release incident? And this is a question to OPG. Now, turning to expansion plans. OPG plans to double the capacity to accommodate decommissioning wastes, as well as the typical wastes that were originally planned. They deem this to be feasible, and will be seeking regulatory approval much, much later, not now. There's some serious concerns about this. Do we even know if that size is appropriate? We don't know the inventory for decommissioning waste. It will be higher in activity than refurbishment or particularly operational waste, but we don't know. Will this proposed expansion be going on while waste is being emplaced, which would be a very dangerous situation? We don't know, because this has been pushed to the future, and that's rather disconcerting. And then, does such an expansion open the door for potentially storing high-level waste spent fuel in this DGR? What other things might happen in the future that aren't on the table right now? Just a note about decommissioning waste, because the activities of some of the key radionuclides are significantly greater, it could lead to an increase of gas generation within the repository. But OPG seems to be confident that this increase would not significantly adversely impact, contribute to adverse dose impacts from disruptive scenarios, and they're always considered unlikely. Questioning, on what basis are they considered unlikely? Acts of terror are unpredictable. You can't reliably estimate their probabilities. So here we have no inventory, nothing presented, nothing can happen. So I just conclude that OPG has an extraordinary crystal ball that the rest of us don't have, that they can foresee in the future without having any facts to depend on. Now, because we don't have an inventory of decommissioning waste, any inventory that's presented here or projected for 2062 is incomplete. You can't just say we're going to add this and then have a projection to 62 that doesn't include the potential, even if it doesn't happen, of storing decommissioning waste. One issue, too, as we move into the future, we've heard a lot of talk about waste acceptance criteria and how these change on a regular basis. They're reviewed and they're changed in a few years. Again, from the public perspective, I'm not sure what that can imply as to what is allowed to be in the waste in this DGR. It's a very vague statement to make that, yes, we do change these, and in what way do the definitions of the type of waste change? Because they're not exactly clear either. Do you establish clearance levels more so you don't have to look after this waste? So these are problems here. Now, I'd like to now turn to WIP. And we've heard a lot about WIP yesterday, of course, but because it was part of my presentation, I will go ahead and move with it. This is just a slide giving the background to WIP, and I will go through slides that repeat some of the same messages so we don't hear them twice or more. The two incidents of concern, of course, are the salt truck fire, the underground fire, and the radiological release event. And as we know, RIP's been closed pending further investigation. In terms of the underground fire, we know that soot was released into the underground and still lingers there. We know 86 workers were there when the fire occurred, were evacuated, but there was some confusion, and some of the workers were transported to the Carlsbad Medical Center for treatment. In terms of the radiological release event, there are elevated levels of americium and plutonium above ground. A radioactive cloud plume was observed over a number of states shortly afterward. The wastes have spread through over 900 meters of underground tunnels and through the exhaust shaft, 600 meters exhaust shaft into the environment. Now, information hasn't been exactly forthcoming to help us. I understand CNSC's made use of the WIP website, as had most of us in the public, but there's a lot that isn't coming forward. So this was a plume map done by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration shortly after the radioactive release. The issue here, and the other one also show you, is a trajectory of the waste done also shortly after the waste. Now, what these slides demonstrate, the previous one here and this one, is the extent, the spread of radioactivity. Now, this is due potentially to one container, and there are thousands of containers. It took just one container to be breached to create an issue of great public concern. How would this situation translate at the DGR at the Bruce site if there was just one? What areas might be affected? How would Lake Huron be affected? How would terrestrial aquatic habitat be affected? How would workers immediately at the site and communities nearby and distant be affected? And for how long? Now, OPG has responded to these incidents, and we keep hearing about degraded safety cultures, whereas OPG has a deep-rooted safety culture, and we can argue about that. OPG is also confident that their measures will prevent similar incidents. And they also indicate their waste are differing characteristics. No design changes are required, and the potential impact on worker and public safety were assessed to be below criteria. This is right out of their responses. Now, here are comments concerning OPG's response. How does OPG safety culture, how is it superior to WIP's? And I will say that there is no such thing as a foolproof safety culture when we're dealing with this kind of material. The other issue is the difference in waste. Now, if you look at the inventories, which I have I've looked at inventories at Los Alamos, at the Argonne labs in Sweden as well, just comparing. Quantities may differ, but the waste at OPG's waste does include transuranics, includes organic, inorganic material. So the nature of the material may be similar, the concentrations could be different. Sorry. In terms of no effects on workers, I have not come across any data that is specific to workers or to public health. There's been released data from the Carlsbad Center, but no independent testing has been carried out on the workers. You cannot conclude that these events have had or will not have any effect on human health in the future. What we do have available, the knowledge we do have, is a number of workers that have been contaminated with internal contamination with alphas. DOE's concluded there's no adverse health consequences. Their conclusion is not warranted. You don't know. We have to realize that the dangers of internal contamination, the latency period for the development of diseases, especially cancer. These workers need to be independently assessed and tracked over a long time. You cannot dismiss this within this short period. Another issue is there's work going on right now in maintenance and repair, entering areas where radioactive releases occurred. These containers, some of them are labeled contact handled, which means you can actually touch them as opposed to remote handled. What efforts are being made to track the health of these workers over time? And this is a question because I simply don't know. I haven't been able to find out what tracking will be done. Another issue is the monitoring data that is now available, and yet now it has gone down in the areas near and away from the site. But this not translate to that these releases are not having an impact on health. The radiation may have been dispersed, but the radiation has not disappeared, not in the months involved. And one of the issues in terms of worker health, detectable amounts of radioactivity are released when the filters, contaminated filters, are changed. The workers do need to wear protective equipment. So this is dangerous work. And as yet, the level of radioactive contamination in the underground tunnels through which the release has traveled is not known. At least I'm not aware of it. And again, I am a public person in this. There's only so much information one gets from a public perspective. Now, the local community is concerned. If you follow some of the meetings that are going on there, the lack of transparency and accountability, uncertainty as to the cause of the explosion, are other containers at risk of being breached, and the risk short and long term to the public and workers. There's other issues that haven't been clarified and still need to be worked on, and that's the suspect barrels from the Los Alamos National Labs. What is the level of radioactivity in that panel room where the breached container, if it's maybe there's more than one located? And very importantly, what is the future of WIPP? Will it be decontaminated? Is it possible? Do we know how to decontaminate this? Does anybody know? Will it reopen? Will it shut down? Or how? This is a huge mess in the US, but it translates to an important mess that we should all be avoiding. Everybody likes to talk about lessons learned, so I thought I better say it too. Human error, mechanical failure are not only possible, they're inevitable, no matter what precautions you take. You cannot create a safety case that will consider or prevent all accidents. Unintended, unpredictable accidents can occur and have occurred in DGRs, and we know WIPP, ASSI2, and Morse-Laban. In fact, I was looking through the risk assessments that were done on WIPP before it opened up, and I cannot find any indication of an analysis of an accident as such as the one that occurred, even though we don't know. Any further probabilities that they estimated for fires and so on were in the order of 1 in 200,000 frequency. So it shows you we do not know how to account for all possible accidents, and we may not necessarily be able to assess them. Now, a study example that pulled out of VOCs in WIPP's waste concluded they do not represent a credible threat of explosion. but the explosion, or as they like to call it, the breach, has occurred, and it might have been due to VOCs. That's not known. Okay, in terms of conclusions, I think it's really important to state, even if you have the most complete and accurate inventory, which is an absolutely essential thing, these inventories alone cannot determine the long-term safety of the repository. There's too many unknowns. Unpredictable factors can influence the safety of a repository in the short and long term. Nevertheless, this does not excuse the uncertainties, underestimations, omissions, and errors in OPG's waste inventory. Another issue dealing with inventory is the contents in each container, a factor which might not have been appreciated at WIP. We've heard of waste characterization. We heard what different containers for different kinds of waste. But how sure are we with all these categories that something hasn't been missed or overlooked? Okay, WIP's not functional. It may not be for quite some time. And it clearly has demonstrated that DGR technology as we presently know it is not safe. OPG has no sound scientific basis for claiming that its DGR can be safely isolating these wastes for the hundreds and thousands of years. There's as yet no technology for containing radioactive waste that is scientifically proven to be safe. And I will say that the plan to double the size of the DGR is unwarranted level of entitlement and arrogance on the part of OPG. We're concerned that what that might lead to. And in conclusion, our recommendations are that the JRP reject OPG's proposed project. We further urge that JRP recommend that further research and study be conducted to develop the safest possible means of isolating these wastes, and to ensure that there is public transparency and consultation in this process. In the interim, the best that can be done is to store this waste above ground so that it can be inspected, monitored, and retrieved in case repairs are needed. Thank you very much.